Good morning, coolest coast. It is time for Coffee on the Coast. Good morning and welcome to Coffee on the Coast. I'm your host this morning, Tina Prigge, and I'm delighted to welcome to the show Amy Meyer, who's the Executive Director of Manitowoc County Historical Society. We're going to be talking about some fascinating local history tidbits. Amy, so good to see you this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for bringing the sunshine, Tina.
I think it's you who's bringing the sunshine, Amy. So I'm really excited because you shared some briefing papers with me in preparation for today, and I learned so much. Okay, so for example, we have a Reed Avenue in Manitowoc. There's Reedsville, the town in Manitowoc County. I always assumed that the reason they were named Reed was that there was maybe a swamp of reeds or some kind of field of reeds. And what I learned from Manitowoc County Historical Society is that's not true. It's actually for a person. Can you tell us more?
It's a person. It's from a pretty phenomenal person. So Judge George Reed is the namesake of both of those locations that you talked about, the village of Reedsville and then Reed Avenue as well. But so Judge Reed, I imagine, this tall, probably like a big beard. I'm not sure if that's completely accurate, but that's how I picture him in my mind. But he had this crazy dream, 1800s, 1870s of bringing the railroad here, which for us, it's like, oh yeah, railroad, that's how towns grow, that's how they prosper. But he was like, you know what, we need to have a rail line in our community. So he started buying up right-of-ways along the road to create this railroad. And obviously, it's not as easy as just, I'm going to make a railroad. You need a lot of partners, you need a lot of labor, you need a lot of materials to make this happen. So unfortunately, it didn't really take off like he had hoped. Obviously, the Civil War supplies were a priority, so it had to even be postponed a little bit after. But he was working with Wisconsin Central and eventually started laying down paths actually throughout northeast Wisconsin. But he created the Manitowoc Terminal Company, which would be kind of his dream of starting the railroad. And you know what? He goes to Milwaukee to go see a show in the 1880s at the Newhall House, and unfortunately dies tragically in a fire at the Newhall House. He can't see the railroad actually become a railroad, but all the work that he did for almost 25 years to lay the bed work and get this started actually eventually did come to Manitowoc, as we know, and the railroad came through Reedsville, came through Branch, which was Lenaville at the time, but he didn't say, I'm done, I quit. He kept on trying, kept going. You think as a judge, he'd have a little more leeway and a little more push, but he had to work as hard as you or I would have to with any dream that we had too. So he's one of my favorite stories to tell middle schoolers.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, so Reed Avenue, Reedsville, named for Judge Reed and his dream of bringing the railroad to Manitowoc County. That is fascinating. Is this an example of part of the railroad that was built because of his efforts?
It is, yeah. So this is where you can actually see a good picture of the roadbed itself in Manitowoc. But when you look at Judge Reed, we have a few railroad mementos of the Wisconsin Central Railway, which he was specifically a part of, different programs, things like that. So there are mementos of his work still around, and his home is actually still standing in the village of Reedsville too, which is very cool.
Oh, that is cool. Connor just chatted in and he said Wisconsin Central, then Sioux Line, then a Wisconsin Central revamp, then Canadian National, a lot of railroad history in our corner of the world. And it's amazing to think that it started with Judge Reed and his dream.
Yeah, a great dream that I think we can all learn a little bit from. Obviously, he didn't give up, and even though he didn't get to see his dream in reality, he didn't get to ride that first rail car down or, sit on the locomotive and wave to the crowds as it went past, but he didn't give up, and that's a really good lesson for all of us.
So you've got a locomotive located out at Pinecrest. Is that part of this
We do.
story?
It is not. Ours is actually a Sioux Line locomotive, but it came to us in a roundabout way. So you'll have to come out and hear the full story, but we have a lot to thank for it. It actually came over on the car ferry from Michigan and has a really great story with Lincoln High School students working on it too, to make it possible for us here. So you'll have to come out to the museum and hear that one.
You know what? Speaking of coming out to the museum, can you tell viewers a little bit about Library Card Free Day? Because that's coming right up.
It is, yeah. We have Library Card Free Day this Saturday, and it's actually been a program that we've been running now, oh gosh, for over 30 years. We've had Library Card Free Day, but if you have a library card, you can come to our museum for free on Saturday. We have story time at 11 o'clock and at 2 o'clock, so you can come into our one-room schoolhouse, Shadyside School, and hear some stories about people that were dreaming and inventing and creating at the turn of the century. So it's a great opportunity, especially for folks that normally can't afford admission. We want to make sure that our museum is accessible as possible. But even if you can't come out this Saturday for Library Card Free Day, we always have an access admission rate. So it's just $2 for you to come on out. Or you can also use your local Manitowoc Public Library and actually check out admission passes for our museum too. So it's a great way to partner together and make sure history is around to learn from and explore and even get a little dirty too.
Yeah, you've used a phrase before that I've heard is like that your hands in history. I love that turn of
Yes,
phrase.
yes, exactly. We're hands-on, hands-in. You know, for example, today we've got kids out there right now from Jackson Elementary, and they're making S-hooks in the blacksmith shop. They're making butter in the cheese factory. They're doing some laundry, which they were a little just crazy excited about. So we always like to be hands in. History isn't just the boring dates and times and dusty books that you find in the basement. It's living, breathing history. Like we talked about with Reed Avenue. How many times do you drive down Reed Avenue or drive through Reedsville? And now you're like, oh my gosh, Judge Reed and this railroad dream. And it's putting a name to a location, to history. It's so cool.
I love it. And you mentioned having this dream. I copied this quote from something that you posted. It says, "Dreams are what this community has been built on." And I love that phrase. Not only does Judge Reed demonstrate that, but even to this day, if somebody has an idea and they believe in it and see it through, it can really change the community, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So, Judge,
Dreams aren't just history.
oh, say that again, Amy.
Oh, I say dreams aren't just in history. We're still doing it today.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So many of the awesome things that exist here on the coolest coast are because somebody dreamed it, right? Even Pinecrest Village,
Yes.
somebody had to have that idea and bring it to fruition and garner support and raise funds and make it happen.
Yeah. And coolest coast too. That's a dream.
That's right. That's right. We're living the dream, Amy. Okay, so
We are.
Judge Reed is not the only famous name that we want to talk about today. So, for example, Waldo
Right.
Boulevard. For a long, long time, I wondered
Yes.
about Waldo Boulevard because I know it had that name long before the "Where's Waldo" trend. So,
Oh
what's in the
gosh.
name
Yeah.
Waldo Boulevard?
Yep. So Waldo Boulevard is actually very timely that you bring this up. So George Edward Waldo, uh, not the Where's Waldo with the crazy hat. George Waldo is really our first Manitowoc son that was killed in the war a war effort, the Civil War. So he was 27 years old, just a young guy in the legal profession, just like Judge Reed. He was a lawyer in Manitowoc. And when the Civil War news came to our community, he was like, all right, I'm going to enlist, I'm going to join, I want to help fight this war effort. So he went, he enlisted, joined with Company K, and went off with Wisconsin Volunteers. But it didn't end there. He actually came back to Manitowoc then and started recruiting and just impressed the people he needed to impress. And he actually became the leader of Company E, the 14th Wisconsin Regiment. So kind of a sad story as well with George Waldo, but he just, a few months into camp and he silo and he was wounded in the chest. So he unfortunately did pass away from his injuries on April 7th, 1862. And just 1 year in the military, and he passes away. He was killed. So obviously news at the time was a little bit slower, but the news to Manitowoc until about 10 days later, and people were shocked. How can this happen to our favorite son that was sent off in the war effort? So the city actually raised $100 to send a reverend to bring Waldo's body back to Manitowoc from Tennessee. And I can't even imagine the shock of the entire community. But then how does the community come together and celebrate him, to honor him? Just I can't imagine those conversations in the midst of not only the shock of losing Waldo, but how many other sons were still fighting in this war effort. And where mom's afraid my son is next. Obviously the Civil War had a huge impact on our community, on our city here. But with George Waldo being that first casualty, I think that news probably hit a little bit stronger than some of the other casualties that would follow. But I would say Waldo Boulevard, named after George Waldo, but so that was constructed in 1927. So it's obviously a while after his passing, but he didn't have a headstone at Evergreen Cemetery. It was kind of sad. So in the year 2000, the Civil War Roundtable actually banded together and put a marker on George Waldo's cemetery stone. So it's kind of a neat story of not only the community coming together 150 years ago, but the community coming together even today to make sure that George Waldo is not forgotten.
Okay, it's incredible to think that it took 150 years before he got a headstone, and it's
Stone.
amazing that his impact lasted, right? Like that people care that far into the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow. And so you mentioned, like, so not only was he the first casualty of the Civil War, he is really the first casualty in Manitowoc's history, right?
Or, mhm. Right. So when you look at the village of Manitowoc and now the city of Manitowoc, for previous battles or conflicts, Manitowoc wasn't Manitowoc. They weren't gathering together, sending their sons off to war. And the Civil War was the first circumstance where you're actually seeing that in our community.
You shared this quote, and I just want to read it. Um, One speaker at the funeral for Waldo said, "A man hath but a short time to live. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as it were a shadow." Wow, that's powerful. Okay, so I've got a picture that you shared, and is this Waldo's actual uniform? Tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so this is Waldo's uniform. We are so fortunate to actually have it in our archives at the museum, and is on exhibit right now in our Welcome Center, in our Stories of the Past exhibit. So this is the uniform, obviously, that Waldo had in his possession. He was not wearing it obviously at the time that he was wounded or killed, but it was his, and it's a nice reminder that he was a person, and he was going off into the war effort, just again trying to do his best and make things right for the community. But this actually was donated to us, one of the first items in our collection, because the Historical Society was founded in 1906 by mainly a group of Civil War veterans who wanted to make sure that our Civil War history wasn't forgotten. And this was in their possession. So it is one of the first items that have called the Manitowoc County Historical Society a museum.
Wow. And so another great reason to come out and visit you, to see this with your own eyes. And
Yes.
the efforts like Waldo, he was involved
Mhm.
then with drills and things like that in Union Park. Is that right?
Yes. So kind of the history of the city of Manitowoc is so strong with our Civil War effort. But obviously, Union Park in Manitowoc is where our local soldiers met, and they marched and they drilled, and that's where they said goodbye to their families. It's not only a place where we play and we celebrate family picnics today, that was almost point A for anyone going into the Civil War. So when the Manitowoc men were presented with the flag of Company A that you saw kind of in the corner of the photo with Waldo's uniform, that's the flag that the women gave to the men before they left town, because they wanted to make sure that they knew why they were fighting. The women made that flag hand sewn for them. And it was a huge reminder of, this is why I'm fighting. This is what's left back home that I need to come home for. And again, this is one of the first artifacts that we had in our collection and was actually donated to us in 1925 after a lot of the Civil War veterans had passed away. But this flag not only saw battle, it was captured, it came back to our city, and that flag graced the coffins of any Civil War veteran that wanted it on their funeral day. So it obviously, if only that flag could tell stories of what it saw, what it experienced. But we have it today, and it's honestly one of my favorite pieces in our collection, and we have thousands of items, but that flag tells a story and connects to people and relationships in the community like no other item, I think, can in our museum.
Do you know how many, just even an estimate, how many Civil War veterans there were from Manitowoc?
Yeah, so we had about 2,000 people. I believe I don't have the actual specific number, but it's over 2,000 men went off into the war effort here in our communities. And just, that's a lot for
That,
what man was at the time. It's huge.
what would the population have been then? It was certainly wasn't
I don't
35,000
even
back
know.
then, right?
Right. No, it was not. I don't know what the population of Manitowoc was. I will have to look into that.
Interesting. Yeah, 2,000 sounds like a huge number.
Right. Yeah. And that's over the entire county, not just the city. But yeah, just I can't even imagine something like that where you don't even know if your child is coming back home, what the Civil War is about. They didn't know a lot of those details that we know today. They knew there was a war and they wanted to go and help.
Yeah, there was no Facebook to check in on and find out what your neighbor thought about it. And
Yes. There wasn't a lot of
okay,
communication back and forth.
no, and as you said, even just news of the death took like 10 days just to reach back home. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
all right. So that's fascinating to know that Judge Reed, real person, things are still named for him. George Waldo, the reason we have the Waldo Boulevard name. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to show a picture. Tell us what we're looking at. What is going on in this picture?
Oh, craziness, honestly. So this is a photo of the Billy Schultz Circus performance exercise at the vocational school in Manitowoc. And if you go to the vocational school's gym, you'll still see some of the pieces from the Billy Schultz Circus still in the gym. But the Billy Schultz
Really?
Circus was, I think, yes, it's awesome. I think the Billy Schultz Circus would make a great Disney film, or just people need to know about this story. But Billy Schultz was a retired circus performer, came back to Manitowoc, and after you can't do circus performing anymore, you become a janitor. So he became a janitor at Washington Junior High in Manitowoc. So this is in the late 20s. And some Boy Scouts figured out that he was a former circus performer and that he could do some pretty neat things. So they were like, Mr. Schultz, can you help us out with this fundraiser we want to do for Boy Scouts? And it was the Manitoween Halloween celebration, 1929. So Billy Schultz is dusting off his acrobatic skills and comes on out, and he was teaching these Boy Scouts what he knew as a circus performer. And people were like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I want my kid to learn that too. So the first Manitowoc Billy Schultz Circus Training School was formed right after that Halloween, and it operated for quite some time, but really was a lifesaver for a lot of families during the Great Depression. Billy Schultz made sure that the families had food, that the kids were well fed, they had clean clothes, they had all their homework accomplished. But he taught them skills, obviously, hanging from trapezes and standing as a huge pyramid tall. It's stuff that we're like, well, how's that helping kids? But the discipline, the relationships that they made, it's so important. And he took care of it in the midst of the Great Depression. And a lot of those kids went on to perform with circuses. Emily Underberg, who we have featured actually in our exhibit here at the Welcome Center, she had records for the amount of revolutions. There's Emily. Yep. She had records for the amount of revolutions on the trapeze bar. And she was filmed by NBC Studios. I can't imagine. She ended with 130 revolutions on that trapeze bar. Like, no net. This isn't, there's no nets under her, no extra strapping. It's just her twirling around, making revolutions on the bar. Oh,
Yeah, so
gosh.
this says she was known as the queen of the revolving trapeze, and her act was called the muscle grind for the strength and endurance. That's amazing. So, Amy, you shared a little video clip that I want to play. I think at near the end of the clip, there's even a little clip of Emily doing her muscle grind. Now, I just want to let viewers know this video clip does not have any audio, so it'll be silent while you watch it. But Amy, did you say this is the only known video of the Billy Schultz Circus?
Yeah, so besides the NBC video that is still somewhere in the NBC archives, this is the only home video that we know of the Billy Schultz Circus, a practice. So if anyone has any stashed away somewhere, we would certainly love to see it and add it to our museum collection. But it's incredible what those kids did, what Billy Schultz Sr. and Jr. were able to teach. But oh gosh, Billy Schultz Circus Training School. It is a story that is for the ages and just makes you feel good.
Cool. Okay, viewers. So again, there won't be any audio while you watch this, but check out this incredible Billy Schultz Circus training clip. I'm dizzy just from watching those revolutions. Oh my gosh. That's so cool that you have that.
Yeah, that is a treasure right there. But the Billy Schultz Circus, obviously for kids today to understand how monumental that is, even for me to understand, it's hard because we're not in that same lifespan of the Great Depression, obviously, and what do we do and what do we do with our kids? But I mean, obviously, I'd be terrified to just here's my son, teach him how to leap off of other people. So just the trust that parents would have had to have had in Billy Schultz to begin with, and his abilities. Oh, I'd be terrified if that was my kid.
Yeah, Connor said this would be the next greatest showman. Yeah, absolutely, Connor.
Mhm.
Can you
Yep.
imagine what that's like to be the one catching the guy flipping through the air and
Oh,
landing on your shoulders? I can't imagine. I can't put myself in the headspace of either of those guys.
no, talk about pressure.
So, did the Billy Schultz Circus travel and perform in different places, or was it really just about training?
They actually did perform. So they were performing all over. We have some really great posters and memorabilia, but they were traveling. They were going out a lot of county fairs, especially around our community in the state of Wisconsin. But the performers went on to graduate from Billy Schultz and went with the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. They were professionals. Billy Schultz taught them enough to be able to go out and do those high scale circuses where they are traveling the world. So it wasn't just, I'm going to be a acrobat in Manitowoc. I'm going to go out, see the world, and show off what Billy Schultz taught me.
So these were real skills that then they could parlay into becoming professional circus performers.
Yeah.
Wow. So did a lot of communities have circus training schools like this?
We're the only one, Manitowoc, Wisconsin, the only circus training school in the United States.
How cool. What a cool distinction. How long did that last? When did that end?
So there's a couple different dates, but it lasted for about 30 years. So Billy Schultz himself obviously wasn't teaching that entire time, but the school that he had created at the vocational school lasted and was able to continue teaching students. Obviously, there's a good like core 10 years where it's the height of this school. But even the education classes today, a lot of that is credited, especially at the early levels, the elementary and the middle schools. Obviously, Billy Schultz was a huge proponent behind getting that into schools.
Wow, that's awesome. Awesome. Again, if you dream it, you can make it happen. Okay, so we've
Yes.
got one more cool, fascinating local history tidbit to share today. Let's talk about Manitowoc's connection to the Titanic.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And you said you never heard this story before, Tina.
I hadn't, I had no idea.
Yes. So Manitowoc has a connection with the ship Titanic that went down. But obviously, 1912, we think about the great Titanic sailing and hitting the iceberg and going down. But Manitowoc had a son on that ship, and his name was Emil. And Emil actually, so he was born here in Manitowoc. His family had a really prominent general store downtown, and so I imagine, his family being friends with the Shooties and comparing prices, probably being competitors. But Emil and his family, they move to Nebraska, and Emil's family again creates a general store there. But as he grows up, he wants to open a theater, an opera house. So he does that in Nebraska. So he's rubbing shoulders with bigwigs in New York City who have theaters, Chicago theater owners. So he decides I'm gonna go overseas, and why not take my trip home on the Titanic? It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm gonna sail on the Titanic. So he had a first class ticket, which I can't even, oh, just the splendor that he was walking into on first class on Titanic, probably thinking it's the sailing home, trip of his dreams. But little did he know that it obviously would end not like his dreams had hoped. But so Titanic goes down, hits the iceberg, and again, the family isn't aware. His sister-in-law goes to New York to bring him home, to help guide him home, and she's searching for him, searching for him. He's not there. She finds someone that she knows that he was traveling with, the Harrises, who were very close family friends. And she sees Mrs. Harris and is like, "Well, where's Emil? What happened to him? I can't find him." And Mrs. Harris goes on to tell him that so they were having dinner on that Sunday night, and Emil was telling him all about what he was up to at home and his niece and his nephew. And the iceberg hits and just so much commotion. But they were standing to board the lifeboats, Mr. and Mrs. Harris and Emil Brandis. And I'm going to read for a section here, but when Mrs. Harris was 10 minutes out to sea, she saw the steamer sink with all those fine men aboard. So Mrs. Harris got on a lifeboat and literally watches her husband and her friend Emil go down with the Titanic. So obviously it's a sad story about one of Manitowoc's sons. But again, just the opportunity to go on the Titanic and the dream that he thought this is going to be so neat. But yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's so
that's a
haunting
sad
too,
thing.
that part that you read especially, right? To know that
Mhm.
families were separated, right? Like there weren't
Yeah.
enough lifeboats, so the women and children get on first, and the
Mhm.
men just like stoically, tragically
Mhm.
go down with the
Waited
ship.
and went down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even being first class too, they would have had to have waited a while if they were at the point that it was going down. How much was that commotion on board the ship of them trying to get up to the front of the line to grab a lifeboat? I mean, what was going through their minds of, maybe I should have waited a week to come home.
Oh, right, right. Every decision that you start to question. I wonder too, being
Right.
first class, right, being higher up than on the ship, did it take longer for them to even become aware of what was happening? Like, did they
Mhm.
have less
Yeah.
response time? I have no idea.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But all
Oh.
these years, Amy, I had never known that Manitowoc had even a tenuous connection to the Titanic. So it's so fascinating
Mhm.
that you share this tidbit with us.
You don't think of our little town of Manitowoc having connections to these not only huge events in our American history, but in world history. Even um, Waldo to be a casualty, one of the first casualties of the Civil War. But all of our history here has this wider connection to the history books or to things that are happening. We're not in our own little bubble here in Manitowoc County.
Yeah, I think Manitowoc County has a far greater impact on the world than we sometimes give consideration to, right? Like, how many times has a person stayed at a hotel and when you go to fill up your ice bucket, it's a Manitowoc ice machine? I mean, that's incredible, right?
Yeah. I take pictures all the time. I'm like, oh my gosh, look what's here.
It's such a nice touch point. Hey, Connor commented and said the Titanic's voyage was almost delayed 2 times. First a coal strike, and then almost hitting another boat leaving port. I did not know that either, Connor. Thank
Oh,
you for sharing that.
it was jinxed.
Right, right. Well, Amy, what was not jinxed was this awesome interview with you this morning. Thank you for taking the time to join us on Coffee on the Coast and sharing these fascinating
Mhm.
local history tidbits. I've learned so much and I feel edified knowing all of this now.
Well, thank you. And yes, I encourage you and everyone else to come out and visit our museum. Like you said, we love to be hands-on history, but it's amazing the amount of stories that reflect connections with the roads that we drive over or walk through and all the communities. And you never know what you'll find in the archives. If you have lived in Manitowoc County for a long time, or if your ancestors have lived here, you're most likely in our archives.
And I love just thinking about our ancestors, like those shoulders that we stand on today, right? Those folks, they were the dreamers of that age. And the things we might take for granted today, they had to work hard, first of all, to conceive of and then to make happen. And here we are today. And that's why history matters. And I'm so glad that you're preserving it and sharing these stories. Amy, tell people how they can learn more, like tell them your website and if you've got a blog or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. So ManitowocCountyHistory.org is the best place to go for information on our programs, our events coming up, also our archives. We also do have about 3,000 images right now, I believe, on an online server. So you can check out information and photos from our archives itself. We do have a biweekly blog for stories from but also check out our Facebook page, Instagram. We also have a podcast that's every single Friday. But lots of great ways to explore our local history, both at our museum and out in the community. And you'll never know when you can literally step into the past. So we're excited. Our team right here of staff and volunteers is just incredible to make sure that the stories aren't forgotten. So thanks for helping us share it, Tina.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. My guest today was Amy Meyer, Executive Director of Manitowoc County Historical Society. So thankful for you and this great conversation, Amy. And thanks, viewers, for watching this episode of Coffee on the Coast. We'll see you next time.